I rise to speak in opposition to House Bill 1464. Several provisions in this bill really are written so loosely and the language is so poor that there's really not a way to comply with this bill. There's really not a way to know if you are complying with the bill. I want to first draw your attention to Section 12, line 745 through line 751, and I'll read the section. No ballots shall be handled without a poll official being present and without documentation on the chain of custody documentation forms of who is handling such ballots and when and why such ballots are being handled. After the activity requiring the handling of ballots is completed, such ballots shall be resealed in ballot boxes or other secure containers, which shall be recorded and witnessed on chain of custody documentation forms as specified by the Secretary of State and shall be signed by the persons having custody of such ballots. This section is something that I brought up in committee when we saw this provision in a separate bill that came through governmental affairs. The language is written so loosely, and it's requiring you to have a poll official present when ballots are being handled. What does the word handled mean? When you look up the word handled in the dictionary, it says to feel or manipulate with hands. Or a second definition is to manage a situation or a problem. So what are we talking about here? Are we saying that you've got to have a poll official available if you touch a ballot, if you move a ballot? I mean, literally, if you pick up a ballot that falls on the floor, do you have to call a poll official to supervise that? When we're talking about elections, it's really important that we have language that is concise because we know what happens when you have loose language in bills. What happens is prosecution is subjective. And that's when we start to see that when black and brown voters exercise their power and it's effective, we start to see more prosecutions. And so I brought this up in committee and I asked, and nobody could answer my question. I simply asked, if the majority of the really important activities are currently already supervised by an election official today, then what additional activities would you like to see supervised? And nobody could answer the question. This section, the way that it's written, to try to comply with this, it probably means that we probably better hold the primary election tomorrow if we want to have results by May 24th, because it's really going to slow down our system. And nothing is worse for the confidence in elections than taking forever to get results. The next section I want to draw your attention to is Section 18. And I know that my colleague spoke a little bit about what happens when you involve the GBI in elections, but I want to go into some more detail because this is very recent history that has not talked about enough that really should be talked about. Section 18 gives the GBI direct jurisdiction to investigate elections. That's not the way our law works today, but this bill will make it so the GBI can directly investigate. Much of the powers that this bill gives to the GBI, the state election board already has those powers. They already have the power to subpoena, and they already have the power to investigate. So then why involve the GBI? And you may say, and actually the bill sponsor brought this up and said, well, what's the problem with involving the GBI in elections? Well, it's very interesting because as Republican legislatures across the country work to ban the accurate teaching of history, it's time for a history lesson. There's a big reason why we should not be involving the GBI in our elections. This country, as well as this state, has had a history of using law enforcement to suppress, to basically do voter suppression. And this works by making folks scared to exercise their political power, and this has mostly been used on black and brown communities. So I'm going to talk a little more about what happened with the Quitman 10, as people refer to it, but it really should be called the Quitman 12 because 2 people were additionally arrested after the initial 10. It's important to hear the details of this story to understand what really happened. When black women flipped the majority white school board in the small town of Quitman, the state of Georgia arrested them and charged them with 120 separate felony counts of voter fraud. Let's talk about the Quitman 10, which was actually the Quitman 12, and how involving the GBI in Georgia's elections in 2010 destroyed the lives of many and had the effect of suppressing black voter turnout, even though no one was ever convicted of any wrongdoing. Not enough people know this story, but it is relevant and recent history. This story is something that sounds like it's out of the 1960 voting rights, civil rights movement, but it's not. This is from 2010. When Nancy Dennard started working for Brooks County Schools in 2000, African Americans had no representatives in key county positions. And she felt that some school board members seemed more interested in preventing property tax increases than providing schools with sufficient resources. So she decided to run for a seat on the school board. After losing campaigns in 2004 and 2008, Ms. Dennard began to focus on absentee voters. The Republican-controlled state legislature, that's us, had made it easier to use absentee ballots in 2005, and Republicans were regularly relying on this voting tactic. In a special election in 2009, Ms. Dennard won. She then recruited two other black women, middle school math teacher Diane Thomas and lifelong educator Linda Troutman, to run for school board in 2010. Most voters, black and white, voted Democratic in Brooks County, so the July primary was the key race. Black turnout tripled from the previous two midterm elections, and both women prevailed, flipping the board from a majority white to a black majority. 6 weeks later, state law enforcement officials under the authority of then Secretary of State Brian Kemp arrested Ms. Dennard at her home 4 days before Christmas. They took her away in handcuffs, placed her in a squad car, walked her into the police station. 11 of her political allies were also arrested, including Linda Troutman, Diane Thomas, and Thomas's sister, Lula Smart, who was an active campaign volunteer. The Quitman 12 were charged with 120 separate felonies. Mugshots of them in orange jumpsuits were plastered all across the newspaper front pages. The broadcast repeatedly on local TV and news, and also used on the Fox News station, talked about evidence of voter fraud. It is funny because history is repeating itself. Ms. Dennard told Yahoo News that she and her allies were arrested because they had upset the racial hierarchy. They thought they could make an example out of me that would kill the spirit of this movement, she said. I knew we had done nothing wrong. The arrest created an impression in the black community that vigorously exercising the right to vote would be punished. Sound familiar? Yahoo News interviewed 24 people involved in the case, including members of the Quitman 12, prosecutors, local officials, and state law enforcement officials, and reviewed more than 1,100 pages of documents obtained through open record laws from the Georgia Secretary of State and the GBI investigation. Some voters told investigators they received assistance in filling out their ballot, but most said they simply were given help to vote the way that they already wanted to vote. Prosecutors also charged the defendants with taking unlawful possession of ballots when they delivered sealed ballots to the post office for others, including family members, even though the law clearly states it is legal to deliver a ballot for a family member. District Attorney Joe Mulholland filed 120 counts in all, felony counts, which carried at least 20 years in prison for each of the Quitman 12 based on scant evidence. When the local district attorney asked the GBI to launch an investigation and promised to prosecute, so very heavy-handed here, the GBI agreed to work with the Secretary of State's voter fraud unit, even though the then director of the GBI, Victor Keenan, told Yahoo News, the Secretary of State's voter fraud unit has statutory authority to conduct those types of investigations. It's really extraordinary that the GBI would conduct voter fraud investigations. There has to be a clear-cut predicate for us to get involved because it's not our responsibility, nor do we have the jurisdictions to do those. Despite the lack of evidence, the state refused to dismiss the case. During the next 4 years, one of the defendants, Latasha Head, died. Lula Smart faced 25 counts and up to life in prison, and she fell into despair and even contemplated suicide. In the end, nobody was convicted of having committed any crimes, and this whole incident ended when Sam Olens issued an official opinion on June 15, 2016, advising what they did was not a violation. This is about one thing and one thing only, all of these bills. It's about overturning the 2020 election results.
Ladies' time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.